Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jarrett Murphy. I'm the executive editor at City Limits, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the home stretch, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the future of New York City's housing crunch. In a little less than 4 hours, the two major party candidates are going to meet for the final debate of this election season, and millions of ballots have already been cast. Many more will come in as early voting arrives in more and more states before the climax of Election Day on November 3rd. We don't know who's going to win. We don't know when we'll know who has won, but we do know that no matter who wins, and no matter how little it gets discussed on the campaign trail, and whether we like it or not, the person in the White House come January 21st will have a major impact on the priority issue in New York City, which is and has long been housing. So tonight we're going to hear from a distinguished panel of experts and advocates about the federal role in that issue, the needs that New York City has, and the extent to which either of the two candidates, Vice President Joe Biden or President Trump, appears prepared to meet them. And so I'm happy to be joined by City Limits staff writer Sadaf Ali Kali. And let me introduce the first two panelists. I'm pleased to be joined by Barika Wiliams, who is the executive director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and Matt Dunbar, the vice president of external affairs at Habitat for Humanity, New York City. Sadaf?
We're also very happy to have with us Victor Bach from senior housing policy analyst at Community Service Society of New York, and Marquis Jenkins, director of organizing at WeACT for environmental justice and a member of Residents for Preserving Public Housing. Marquis, we're going to start with you. Housing in New York involves a lot of problems and a slew of policies, but from your perspective, what's the most important way the federal government is involved?
First of all, I want to say thank you to City Limits for bringing me to be a part of this very important conversation, and thank you and the rest of my colleagues are on this call. I think the most important piece for the federal government to fund is public housing. Public housing for me is ground zero. It is the place, particularly in New York, where the poorest of the poor live, right? If as outside of being homeless, when we talk about low-income residents or extremely low-income residents, we are talking about public housing. It is considered the last frontier. And right now, we are in jeopardy of losing our public housing if we don't find the funding that is needed to address all the issues that are plaguing public housing residents currently.
And Vic, for you, what's Washington's role in the local housing scene?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to realize that roughly a quarter of the city's rental units are federally assisted in one way or another, whether it's public housing, project-based Section 8, low-income housing tax credits, or Section 8 vouchers. We're enormously dependent on continuation of these programs to sustain what we have of affordable housing. And obviously, we would want Washington to expand it even further. Secondly, we're expecting an avalanche of evictions as a result of the pandemic. And right now, I assume that Nancy Pelosi and the White House are negotiating an emergency rent assistance package that will help New Yorkers troubled by inability to pay their rents. And of course, we have a huge homelessness problem, which would be addressed, but needs to be addressed by a comprehensive federal housing policy, as well as, not to mention, an economic recovery problem on which Washington is crucial.
Matt, I know your focus is primarily on home ownership, but speaking about that or more broadly, if you had to sum it up in a few words, what would you say President Trump's impact on housing policy in New York City has been over the past 3.5 years?
Well, thank you, Jarrett, and thank you for including us in this conversation. You know, I think that the real impact has been, to a certain degree, when it comes to affordable home ownership, is uncertainty. Each year, Habitat for Humanity Network goes to Washington, D.C., and we advocate for a host of federal programs that support affordable housing and affordable home building and access to home ownership, across the country. Starting from year one, essentially a lot of the programs that we have advocated for, in fact, all of the budget lines that Habitat advocated for were actually zeroed out in the president's initial budget. And so a lot of the work that we've done has been, consistently to advocate for, making sure that those programs like Home and CDBG and SHOP, these are various types of programs that invest in affordable housing and down payment assistance, are fully funded. And to a certain degree, we've been successful in that through partnerships in the Congress over the years. But also, is looking at the long term. There have been, certain rollbacks to planning and to approaching of our affordable housing strategies that were implemented and in the process of being worked out, but were rolled back by the current Trump administration. So a lot of that, in relation to advancing affordable housing, has been paused, even though a lot of the city has continued to move forward as if it were not.
Barika, what would you say about Trump's impact on the housing scene?
I think one of the clear places that we've seen Trump's impact on housing here in New York City is thinking about the way that he's rolled back and really been a huge detriment to understanding access to housing and housing discrimination. So rolling back the Obama era advances around AFFH, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing, to really say that jurisdictions have to proactively have a plan to combat housing discrimination, rolled back a lot of key pieces of that, is obviously and very much in a concerning to enraging way, been doubling down on being on really creating and promoting this narrative around what it means to be low income and implicitly a person of color coming into the suburbs, and what that means for crime and threats. And really is quite concerning, creating this narrative that low income residents, homeowners, tenants, what have you, coming into quote unquote white suburbs are a threat or something to be feared. And it really starts to harken back to the 60s and 70s narrative that we're hearing, which seemed much further away from where we were just a few years ago, when we were finally taking some steps forward on housing discrimination.
Yeah, it's like a greatest hits or ungreatest hits from earlier seasons. Just to stay with you, Barika, for a second, because Vic mentioned it, and I want to make sure we get to it early on. The eviction moratorium that's in place at the federal level now, the Centers for Disease Control issued it. There's some question about how durable it is, even for its duration, but it does expire, I believe, at the end of the calendar year. What do you think the federal government will do? What do you think it should do to try to continue to extend protections for renters here in New York and elsewhere?
I think the first concern and problem that we know and have heard across the board with the CDC's eviction moratorium is that it has to be proactively asserted by a tenant. So you have to look through the paperwork, identify whether or not you qualify, proactively go out, download it, fill it out, and then submit it to your landlord, which is a big process for a lot of tenants. And we're hearing reports from our brother and sister organizations across the country that tenants are going through the housing court process. They don't know that this is available to them. They're clearly impacted by COVID. They're still being evicted. They don't have legal representation, and judges aren't telling them that they should be doing this. So I think while it's put in place, there's even a huge question about how effective it is being in this moment in time. And then regardless, at the end of the day, we know when it sunsets, whether it's your local jurisdiction, your state jurisdiction, or the federal moratorium, that when we get to that point, we have millions of tenants across the country who will not have what it costs to rent, right? Most people, the Fed Reserve data is most people can't pay $400 to $700 without having to dip into credit cards or borrow money from friends and family. And when we're in a place where everybody is underemployed or unemployed right now in mass, and that's disproportionately so for our low income and very low income residents, then the question is, where are they going to get it, right? Why do we actually think as a society right now that anybody has 3 to 6 months worth of rent or mortgages in their back pocket? They don't. We all know that they don't, right? Like most of us don't, right? So, it's just this, and Vic touched on it, it's this terrifying thing of, we know that it's coming. We know it's coming for tenants. We know it's coming for homeowners. We know it's, and we know from historical recessions the impact and ramifications it has when we completely destabilize the housing market. And specifically, that falls disproportionately on people of color. It means that you eradicate generations worth of wealth building.
The House did propose a $100 billion part of its package for emergency rent assistance. And it's also trying to, they're also trying to get aid to state and local governments that might be also crucial in sustaining households threatened by eviction. So a lot depends, I think, on the negotiations that are happening right now in terms of our local capacity to deal with it.
True. Sadaf?
I had a question for Marquis about what he thought of the NYCHA's blueprint plan and where the federal role, what the federal role would be in that plan that Ross introduced earlier this year.
Sure. So at WeACT, we're looking at the blueprint from an environmental justice perspective, because that's just the lane that we play in. The blueprint is a very ambitious plan, and I think that it has potential. But what I have been hearing from residents, resident leaderships, and all alike is that it's concerning the way in which the process of how they are unveiling the blueprint. Currently, the blueprint is in a proposal state and will require a number of steps in order for that proposal to become a reality. But what is clear and what we have seen throughout history is that there is no plan would be successful without adequate resident leadership and input and decision-making as part of the process. The Housing Authority is asking public housing residents to support and endorse a plan that would essentially end public housing as we know it in New York City, if this plan goes through. And again, while it is an ambitious plan, now is not the time to try to force a plan on residents. Residents need the opportunity and ability to really be able to vet this plan that's coming down the pipeline. I don't think any resident that I've spoken to believes that we don't need a plan to save public housing. It is clear today, right, that the Housing Authority is looking at a $40 billion deficit, right? And so that money needs to come somewhere. Is this blueprint the way to get it? Possibly. But in order for, again, any plan to succeed, it must have residents. And residents currently don't have the ability to organize residents, get residents' feedback, or even have the ability to look at the finances to truly understand where is the funding loss, where is the funding most needed. And so what I'm hearing the call to action is for more time to be able to look at this plan, have input, and be at the table when decisions are being made, and not being forced to do this during a pandemic.
I mean, the reason that even a plan exists is because there's been a historical context to public housing. Can you talk a little bit about why we even have a blueprint? How did we come to this point for NYCHA?
Sure. We have seen a steady decrease in funding from all levels of government, from the federal, from the state, and from the city government, going as far back as the Clinton administration. Right, Republican or Democrat, we have seen a disinvestment in public housing. And so here we are today with a $40 billion deficit. And the call to action now is to bring in the private market to save public housing. And while that may be a direction that residents want to go, again, right, residents have the ability to vet all of these plans. We've seen through Hope 6, where we have lost a vast majority of public housing throughout the country We have seen a number of plans, TRA, we have seen the federalization. All of those plans did not fulfill its promise. And so here we are with a plan that is even more ambitious than the ones that we've seen in the past. And it fears me if we're not able to make sure that the residents are fully engaged, because we do need a comprehensive and a big plan to save public housing. And not just, right, for the residents who live in public housing, but for the neighborhoods, right, where these public housing developments reside. In New York City, public housing is a city within the city. At WeACT, we are working on a project called Community Power. And we are showing how public housing can be a viable resource to all of its surrounding neighbors. We are working with the public housing residents of Carver houses in Harlem to install solar panels on their rooftops so that we can provide a discount on electricity for the surrounding neighborhoods. When we talk about public housing residents, we are talking about all the essential workers who live in the city, who operate this city. We are talking about the health conditions and what happens if these workers get sick and they are not able to do their jobs. There is so much at stake, again, not just for the public housing residents, but the entire city that relies on public housing residents.
Vic, I just wanted to follow up with you on that. Do you think the city and the state have kind of decided that the feds are out of the game here?
That the city and the state are out of the game?
Yeah.
Well, I think if NYCH's blueprint goes forward, they certainly would not have to make the capital commitments we're all demanding right now, both levels of government. One of the positives about the plan is its comprehensiveness, and that it takes advantage of an existing HUD program, Section 18, which is intended for what are called obsolete public housing developments, and it provides a rich stream of tenant protection vouchers, which the blueprint relies on. And I guess according to NYCH's calculations, if that came through, that would be enough to restore decent conditions across all of NYCH's developments. The big question is what happens when HUD runs out of tenant protection vouchers? And I think that's one of the big obstacles that we have to cross. And that very much, I think, depends on the election in November in terms of bringing the capital and the funds needed to restore not only public housing, but sustain a whole host of federal housing programs.
Matt, can you talk a little more about what we've seen so far from President Trump on home ownership? You referenced in your intro some of the zoning and planning changes. I think affirmatively furthering fair housing ties into that, but talk a little more about that. And also something that doesn't get much attention, which is proposed changes that at least the president has suggested for the Federal Housing Administration, for FHA. Do you see a potential impact from those on affordable home ownership in the city?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit further. I think Barika, really nailed it when she was referring to the rolling back of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. That rule was put in place to implement the part of the Fair Housing Act from 1968 to ensure that it wasn't just not to discriminate, but to actually advance desegregation and equity and equality in our housing market. And so, by rolling that back, we do see a escalation in advancements of plans to deal with some of those issues. And I think it's important to note that some people may think that these discriminations and roles that lenders have played were a thing of the past. But a Newsday article that did a really in-depth investigatory dive into some of the real estate market just outside of New York City and Long Island showed a very large discrepancy in how realtors were showing properties to people of different colors. it's that kind of a policy and practice that the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was meant to address, and to ensure that cities and municipalities were really addressing discrimination that way. Similar areas were in relation to mortgage lending and lenders essentially steering certain borrowers to higher cost mortgages, which is a practice that continues today. One of our volunteer partners, a clergy member, told me about an experience that he had in getting a condo, and how his lender was actually steering him to higher cost mortgages. All of these things have been disincentivized when it comes to the actual enforcement. The fair lending and equal opportunity arm of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was actually, kind of defanged in its ability to actually implement the enforcement of settlements that are dealing with exactly these types of things. So I think it's important as we move forward to make sure that both enforcement and equality within some of these structures that have been proven to be discriminatory, continue to be investigated, continue to be enforced moving forward. And that's something that we've seen, a real lack of focus on, or really a move away from under the current administration.
Barika, let's talk briefly about the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, a critical tool in urban development, urban housing development especially. It's my understanding that there actually are a couple of different proposals from different elements of the federal universe, that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, everyone's favorite office, has one version, and the Fed, I think, has a different one. It's obviously very technical, but speaking broadly, do those proposals generally go in a good place for New York City? Is there some hope that maybe if there were a new president come Jan 20th, that we'd tear it up and start over? What are you looking for on CRA?
Yeah, so they actually do not go in the same direction, which makes this all the more complicated. So we've got a rule that actually has gone past the proposal stage by the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, that sort of moved lightning through the comment period. Most of the comments were, especially the community advocacy and stakeholder comments, were in opposition to this. This is the rules and the framework for how financial institutions are responsible for lending and investing in low-income communities, with the understanding of the legacy of redlining. So this is coming directly out of redlining, and that's part of where CRA comes from. And the OCC is really looking to roll a lot of what we feel like actually moves forward impactful investment in low-income communities and communities of color, to roll that back. And so very much concerned and not looking forward to if the OCC's rule was to move forward. At the same time, right now, currently, the Fed Reserve has a ANPR. So this is like a call for feedback on their proposed rule, which very much is trying to look specifically at racial equity, is trying to think about how to strengthen the CRA, strengthen impact in communities. And I think most notably, the Federal Reserve seems to really actually want to have engaged in in-depth conversations with the communities impacted. They intentionally tried to design their comment period so they could really be getting feedback, and are reaching out proactively to various different communities to have those conversations. So I think we see two very different directions, and depending on where we end up in the next few months, I think we're going to see one sort of move forward and the other one, but these are sort of different Fed entities. So it's also going to be interesting, regardless, how the two entities ultimately resolve the fact that they are currently headed, three entities really, because there's a third one that's sort of in the middle in flux, but how they ultimately resolve the fact that they're not headed in the same direction right now.
I want to take a quick second. We've been getting several great questions from our audience. A few of them are things that we've touched on. Some of them I think will come up later, but I want to ask one. I'm not sure who wants to handle this, so it'll be put out to the group, and raise your hand if you want to jump in. But is there any federal policy that affects things like urban homesteading, HDFC co-ops, limited equity co-ops? Are there any federal mechanisms that have an impact on that? And has there been any action on those in recent years?
I'll jump in on this. To a certain degree, cooperative ownership hasn't been as emphasized on the federal level. I know it's a major area and part of our housing stock here in New York City, and Habitat for Humanity really does support and really focus on multifamily limited equity cooperative ownership, and also in the same vein, the community land trust movement. And generally speaking, the federal government hasn't invested a ton in limited equity cooperatives, but I think this is an area of potential growth that could be a focus for the federal government in providing more lending and backing for loans for tenants to potentially purchase their homes, which is a movement that has been gaining steam within the larger conversation around home ownership. And so, the federal government coming in and providing support for some of those conversions of existing housing stock could be a real way that we could tackle some of the fair housing issues and access to home ownership in neighborhoods and communities that are now too expensive. And so doing that through financing, down payment assistance, supporting capacity building and acquisition funds for community land trusts. These are all ways that the federal government really could potentially get into the space more. But as of right now, it has not been a major emphasis of federal strategies.
Matt, has the city used the federal community development block grant funds to support, which are flexible, to support local homesteading and cooperative efforts, or do we know? Trump obviously has proposed over and over again to zero it out.
Yeah, a lot of the home ownership support that we've received from the city in creating new cooperatives has, I believe, predominantly been through, the city's capital plan. CDBG is a program that as you said, is flexible and could potentially be used. So an increase to CDBG aligned with local strategies that seek to invest more in cooperative conversions and or creation would be a great mechanism, to increase access to multifamily affordable home ownership. But I would have to check in to see exactly where some of those sources of funding and if they have been from the CDBG. I'm not fully aware if all of that funding has come from that program.
I'm actually fascinated by that conversation because I think that's a conversation that can be brought to the public housing table. Mm-hmm. This plan, that the blueprint for change is primarily kind of based on some directives that come directly from HUD. HUD introduced some conversion plans, and home ownership is part of those conversion plans that were introduced. But I certainly would be intrigued to have that conversation within the public housing sector.
Yeah, I'd also add to this. Sorry, the some of the strategies about limited equity cooperatives could really potentially be aligned in potential reforms to the low income housing tax credit program. As of right now, the program at the end of 15 years when there needs to be a refinancing, oftentimes it's refinancing as a rental preservation deal, and the affordability is extended for another 15 years. The federal government could potentially incentivize strategies that would allow for and finance the potential purchase of those buildings from the tenants, even if it is a majority percentage of the tenants, if some remain renters, as a way to both preserve the housing stock, but also to create affordable home ownership through cooperatives. So that's one area of potential growth within the LIHTC program.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the places where, depending on what happens, there's the opportunity to really start to change some of our housing tools to actually match the data metrics of where we are right now as a national housing market. Most of our tools are built on a traditional market of you're a renter and you pay a certain amount of income to rent, or you're a homeowner and you pay your mortgage and you have a 30-year fixed mortgage. And in reality, those things are very much misaligned with where most people are right now, right? Like we are in a place where on average, we're almost to the point of most average Americans, let alone New Yorkers, let alone low-income New Yorkers, paying 37 to 40% of their income to housing costs, right? So if we know that the traditional frame doesn't work anymore, that it's not like whether you're in, you know, St. Louis or whether you're in New York City, that you can't just transition from renter to homeowner, we're going to have to start to come up and be more innovative in how we develop different options for people to then both build wealth, have equity, and create stable homes. And I think to some of the work that Marquis and WE ACT have done, it also gives people the opportunity to then say, we as tenants, as homeowners, as co-op owners, whatever it is, believe and invest in energy efficient housing. We want X, right? And then to make sure that that environmental safety is a part of their home and a part of their life, as opposed to right now, it's just like, well, I rent a unit and I probably have very little control over that, right? And so I think people need the flexibility to be able to identify that and change it for their own livelihoods. And we've got to start to create tools that match that.
I think that kind of brings us to what tonight's presidential debates will be all about. Vice President Joe Biden released his housing plan in July, and it's fairly extensive. Vic, can you tell me a little bit about if the plan does enough on public housing, and does it open any doors for the kind of innovation that Matt and Barika were discussing?
Biden has proposed $100 billion for production and preservation of affordable housing. And a portion of that includes public housing. I'm not sure at the moment how much of that is for public housing per se. But there are also a number of other initiatives that Democrats have brought forward in the House and in the Senate for an infrastructure package that includes affordable housing, which would deliver about $70 billion for public housing preservation, and that would bring NYCHA about $20 billion out of it. Those are bills that have been introduced by AOC, Green New Deal for Public Housing, by Maxine Waters, by Nydia Velasquez, and the like. And the Democratic senators have also put together a blueprint for infrastructure that includes a similar healthy dose for affordable housing. So much depends on what happens in November. But if the administration does turn over, I think it presents a fairly promising picture, considering the dismal last 4 years for affordable housing.
Right. And another idea that I thought was really interesting, and I don't know if it's a big deal, Barika, but Biden's talked about universal vouchers.
Right.
It is a big deal. You know, actually, it's a huge deal, and I think for a lot of us in the housing community and space, I think it was a promising sign to see a presidential candidate propose something new and different on housing, regardless of how you feel on it or what your take on it is. Unfortunately, housing has been one of the issues that for most families' lives is front and center, but in the national political discourse, oftentimes sort of gets glossed over and doesn't take center stage. So, you know, the idea that we would guarantee vouchers for any low income or moderate income, both tenants and homeowners, I believe is the proposal, who are paying more than 30% of their income to their housing costs. It's just rental. I'm remembering now, but that's pretty significant, right? And we're talking about 17 million people in the U.S. that could potentially impact. That's a game changer, right? And it potentially is using housing vouchers to get to some of the disparities that currently renters, and especially low income renters, don't have access to currently in our tax code. So that's also an interesting piece, because so much of our tax breaks are really targeted and geared towards home ownership. So it's a huge opportunity to sort of think about and balance out, recognizing the need to aid and assist renters, which is a growing segment of our national population.
In New York, I think the universal voucher program would have to be accompanied by a stepped up construction of affordable housing. Even with our measly number of housing vouchers, households are having trouble finding units as is. With universal vouchers, they would still have problems. So we would have to really step up our construction program.
And probably tighten up enforcement of source of income discrimination as well, to boot.
Yeah.
Marquis, I wanted to ask you, one of the things you mentioned earlier was your concerns about resident engagement, and that's been said about a lot of elements of the affordable housing picture, but particularly about NYCHA and some of its plans over recent years. Is there anything that the feds can do to facilitate what you would find to be like a productive model of resident engagement? Can they give the city the room to do that? Can they force the city's hand to do that? And do you see anything in the Biden plan that suggests that they will have that kind of community-focused approach to development?
Sure. I mean, and thank you for asking that question, because it is key. Public housing residents have the strongest protections, stronger than any other resident in the city and perhaps in the country. The 964 Federal Code of Regulation give residents a ton of power, put the CCOP president on par with the NYCHA board, and it puts resident association presidents on par with the management. But I think ultimately what stifles and what creates a hierarchy in those relationships is the funding stream that comes to support organizing. And I think one thing I would like to see change in any scenario is that we give resident leadership independence by allowing the funding stream to come directly to them. Oftentimes this becomes a challenge because when residents want to start an initiative or when residents want to hold the housing authorities accountable, they have to approve and they have to propose an argument for why they deserve access to that funding, as opposed to just having the ability to consult with their residents and say, this is how we're going to move forward with this funding that we have a right to use.
Matt, I want to ask you a question. This kind of runs parallel to the point Vic just made about universal vouchers versus the supply of rental housing. On the homeownership side, Vice President Biden proposes expanding down payment assistance and I think some other moves to help first-time homeowners and moderate-income homeowners. That is a demand-side policy. Do you think that there is a potential supply problem there? And also a financing problem. Obviously, we wouldn't want to equip a new generation of homeowners just to run into the same problems of predatory lending and balloon loans that people ran into before the financial crisis. Is the infrastructure there to deal with a kind of empowered generation of first-time homeowners?
Yes, there's a few aspects of the Biden plan that are interesting in this space. You mentioned the down payment assistance, which would essentially be an advanced tax credit that would be available upon purchase of up to $15,000. And so that you wouldn't have to wait for your tax bill. You would be able to implement that right at sale for first-time home buyers. But there is definitely a supply problem. And so the Biden plan proposes incentivizing municipalities and counties to essentially come up with plans to deal with exclusionary zoning, which is essentially the practice of building into your land use and your zoning codes, mechanisms that would limit essentially the supply. Across the country, there's some municipalities and even states that have eliminated single-family zoning, which people on both sides of the aisle have articulated single-family zoning essentially being an artificial way that home prices have essentially gone up and that housing stock has been limited in supply. And so, the Biden plan does put into play some incentives to access, certain amounts of CDBG and transportation block grants should areas actually put into place plans to do inclusionary zoning, essentially allowing for opportunities to develop more density, as long as some of that includes affordable housing, to really try to create more opportunities for people to purchase. And this is a real issue in New York City. The nationwide homeownership rate is about 64%. And in New York City, we're actually at 31% in our homeownership rate. And there is a huge gap when it comes to the Black and white homeownership gap of white New Yorkers in New York City owning at about a 43% rate, with Black New Yorkers, New York households essentially below 30%. So both the supply side and providing down payment assistance, but also incentivizing rezonings of neighborhoods to create more opportunities for home building and supply is really what we need at this point.
Can I jump in on this? So I think on the sort of whether or not both on the rental and the home ownership side, our supply is whether we're going to be able to keep up with supply. I would say right now in New York City, the answer is no. And it's not clear how we could do it for either direction, right? So when we're looking at average new construction rentals, we're talking about a 2-bedroom that is easily pushing above $2,300–2,500. And the average sales price for a home ownership unit right now is somewhere $650K. And that's down from where it has been historically and recently. So when we think about those two numbers lined up with the average New Yorker making, the average New York household, not a person, household, making somewhere in the range of about $75,000, it's really clear to see how much there is a huge gap between the price that we put things online and on the market for and what people will be able to afford. And so what does it look like in a high cost environment like New York City when you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars between where we're going to be able to produce right now with given our market and given the current prices and where people are, and how much will any voucher or tax credit have the ability to start to fill that gap?
Yeah, and I'll also just say to your earlier question about the access to mortgage financing, if you're talking about access to credit to kind of fill that gap that Barika was just talking about, currently that doesn't exist. There is obviously some of the areas that we've already talked about in making sure that disparate impact and enforcement of fair lending is actually strengthened. That is one area to avoid some of those subprime mortgages that were brought in the past. But I think it's really important that both the federal government, in partnership with state and municipal governments, especially in high cost markets like ours, really think creatively about use of things like CDBG, which the Biden plan proposes to add $10 billion to, and for home, which would add $5 billion under his plan, to be able to implement, really potentially creative mechanisms to actually create a more robust alternative ownership market, utilizing CLT strategies, utilizing acquisition funds, kind of, aligning things like tax collection and the tax lien sale policies of New York City to be more closely aligned with some of our preservation work, to really seek to create a larger portfolio of affordable homes, being that I think it's only 9% of the homes on the market were affordable to people of low to moderate income. And a large majority of those are actually being purchased by investors and various investment funds and turning into rentals. So I think it's really critically important that whoever has the second term actually start be thinking a little bit more creative about how we approach the housing market.
Barika, I had a follow-up question. How creative do you think the Biden plan has been when it comes to supportive housing and homelessness? And how could some of those policies that he wants impact New York, given where we are right now?
No, I mean, I think the Biden plan is trying to be aspirational and saying that it actually really wants to tackle homelessness, which is more than many other folks are even interested in talking about right now. But I think there's huge questions about how that actually comes to be, when we've got huge discrepancies between people's earning and the cost of housing. But then B, there is no pathway right now to ending homelessness unless we address the immediate crisis of potentially having a sea of people sliding into homelessness, right? And I think the other piece that we really need to recognize in this is how people experience homelessness. It's not like the eviction moratorium stops and 3 days after we've got thousands or nationwide millions of people who become homeless. The way that this happens is you fall into homelessness, right? You surf with some friends, you hang out with family, you crash with somebody, you're in a car. And so the homelessness epidemic that will hit from this is not just the day after. It is going to be for years and continue to ripple across communities, right? What is it? There's landlords who refuse to rent to people who have gaps in their history, right? So it could create this perpetual state of people being in a place where they cannot find and secure a home, right? So I think that's an obstacle and a challenge for addressing homelessness and thinking about supportive housing, which needs to be tied to services and needs to be tied to mental health. These things have to be intertwined. That I think really ultimately ends up in the nuance and the actual implementation of the plan. But I would say to some of what Vic and Marquis and Matt have said is some of the things around flexibility do start to enable that, right? If we're adding more money into CDBG and I'm a jurisdiction and I know what I need is domestic violence housing or homelessness of families or homelessness of single men, right? Then I can start to tackle that. And I have the flexibility to tackle that. Whereas right now, if we're talking about slicing it, or if it's so restrictively constructed, then I don't have a lot of options.
Right. And to zoom in on sort of what we're talking about of this multi-pronged approach, right? There is the homelessness, right? But then there's the fight to keep what, right? And looking at the conditions of our home, right? As we talk about the coronavirus pandemic, public housing residents have been hit the hardest, and it has exposed what residents have been saying for decades about how the conditions of lead, mold, and pests have had direct impact on these individual houses. And so what I want to see in either plan and in either conversation is how we're talking about how we're making these improvements into people's homes and thinking about how we redesign some of these homes so that we are addressing all of those concerns and issues, because part of it is the way we ventilize public housing. For example, when we look at this virus and how it's airborne, and if we are seeing mold and we're seeing all types of air quality problems in public housing, how are we going to address those things? Again, when we think about who is being impacted and the movers and shakers of this city, right? The police officer, the bodega guy, the person who works for the ambulance, all of these folks are crucial. And if they get sick, that has a direct impact on how our city operates. So we have to think about the housing that we have and how do we make sure that people are not dying in their homes because of the conditions.
I want to ask a great question that just came in from the chat, and that goes to an element of federal housing policy that, it is present in almost every discussion that I've had about the Bloomberg plan and the de Blasio plan, which is rent levels, AMI. And the question is, does the Biden plan address the issue of affordable housing? And I guess, should it? Vic, is there any movement on AMI or rent levels in affordable housing in the Biden plan? And is that something the feds should address?
Well, I think that depends on the provision of rent subsidies that allow us to deepen the targeting of the affordable housing we build. With a universal voucher problem, with a universal voucher program, I think that problem may be largely solved because it would provide deep enough rent subsidies to be able to allow our new affordable housing or existing to accommodate some of the lowest income households. So I think that's very much tied to the voucher program that Biden has proposed.
So we're coming toward, go ahead, Barika, sure.
The other piece that I would say, so the first question, does the Biden proposal change AMI or how we calculate AMI in any way, shape, or form? No, it doesn't say that. But I would also signal to the fact that in the Obama administration, they did pilot localized AMIs in a few places. They actually did a pilot to see what setting local AMIs would look like. And so I think that's a question of whether it would be something that this administration, that a Biden administration would potentially go back and look to see the outcomes of that, and if it has any space to continue.
The AMIs is simply a measure of determining income levels. It still depends on whether the numbers work.
Yeah.
And,
at the end of,
and with deeper rent subsidies, the numbers will work.
Yeah.
The lowest income household.
True. Sadaf, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself, excuse me. And of course, all of these ideas and policies are great, but are they actually viable? Could we see Trump's agenda or Biden's plan getting through Congress, especially when Biden's plan is attached to like a $13 billion price tag? And any of you are welcome to answer that question.
Well, he is proposing to roll back the tax cuts that Trump brought about, which would create some of the capital that's needed for a $13 billion program. I'm not sure how much it would generate, but it would roll it back significantly. It would give him some flexibility in moving federal money around across a variety of programs.
Yeah, I also, it doesn't really address a lot of that, a lot of where the funding is going to come from. But one area that I would think that they would probably take a look at is the mortgage interest deduction,
Right.
And changes to the tax code under this administration that increase the standard deduction for families, of lower incomes, really kind of made that mortgage interest tax deduction essentially a deduction that's predominantly used by wealthier people to essentially, it's a gigantic subsidy program, and it predominantly is a subsidy program for higher income families, with larger mortgages, right? So that is one area that they could potentially look at to provide savings that, could be transferred over to pay for some of these ideas.
I think another place for this that sounds funny, because this is really about framing and not about the actual dollars, is that Biden has been talking about housing as tied to infrastructure. And there's a history and legacy in this country of really understanding infrastructure and infrastructure investments as a way to get people back to work, reactivate the economy, and get us out of recessions. And so there is a history and willingness to put money into infrastructure, even when we're in a budget crunch and a recession. And so if housing gets to be lumped into a part of that, it actually opens up some resources in a way that we traditionally wouldn't necessarily have thought of.
Good point.
So as a final topic, as our time almost runs out, President Obama, when he was sort of charting our path out of an earlier crisis, channeled FDR and said at least once and maybe a couple times that protesters and advocates and activists had to make him do the things that they wanted him to do, that they had to create an environment in which he'd have no choice but to listen to people who are pushing for more transformative change. I'm curious, we don't know how the election is going to come out, but let's assume, for argument's sake, not to put our cart before the horse, but that Joe Biden wins. We have a Democratic president. We may or may not have a Democratic Senate. I'd like from everybody some advice for us and for the audience that's watching, people in New York. What's the next step for making sure we get the kind of housing plan the city needs? What's the one thing that you think folks could do? Why don't we start with Matt and we'll go down the line from there. Matt, what's your advice?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think, getting involved and using your voice is extremely important. In the Habitat world, we like to say and encourage our supporters to build louder, right? And so not just come out on the volunteer side and help build a single home, but actually contact your elected officials and let them know that affordable housing is of critical importance. And this goes from the local to the state. And tonight we're talking about the federal housing policy. So, a lot will depend on Congress. Congress makes the budget. you know, the president puts a budget forward to Congress, and then they take it as advice, and then they build the budget out in negotiations with the White House. So I think a lot will depend on what Congress looks like, but we really encourage everybody listening, you know, take what you've learned, do some further research, and reach out to your local representative and your senator to really encourage that an advanced affordable housing agenda gets moved forward, you know, no matter who is president come January.
Barika, what do you think?
Similar to Matt, what we talk about at ANHD is building community power. And so this ties to me, I would say, you know, figure out a local community-based entity that works on housing, land use, whatever it is, and environmental justice, energy efficient buildings. Get involved with them, get engaged with them, and then work with them. And on your own, to Matt's point, start amplifying your voice. I don't even know that it needs to be so complicated of what exactly you're asking for. I think first and foremost, we need to be pressing up from the federal level all the way to the local level. I care about housing. Housing matters to me. I'm spending 40% of my income on this. I need you guys to fix it. I need not to have a broken elevator, right? And that narrative has to start to rise. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be in this place. So I think we've got to put the pressure on that this is a critical issue, and not just for us as groups that do this, but for families across the nation.
Marquis?
Sure. This is my favorite question. I agree with what was said, right? What we have learned, because as public housing residents, we have been struggling for well over a decade, is that both Republican and Democrats have to be held accountable. We have no permanent friends. We have no permanent enemies. We have to hold them accountable. And what I am seeing is the voices of public housing residents getting louder and louder as this problem is becoming more and more intense. But public housing residents have a history of fighting, particularly here in New York City. We have seen the decline in public housing through programs like Hope 6, all across the country, and we hold strong. We have well over 300 public housing developments, and that is because residents like you, public housing residents, stand up and claim ownership. So my advice to all of you is to keep fighting, because it's working. They are hearing us, and change is coming.
Finally, Vic, any advice for activists
I
out there?
agree with everything that's been said wholeheartedly. I also think we ought to recognize that we have some fierce Washington housing advocacy organizations that will be fighting for us and trying to link with us locally. And it's a good idea for us to keep in touch with them. Yes, certainly the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And there are a number of other Washington advocates we count on and work with who are right there in the Capitol and working hard at it.
Great point, and great points from all of you. Thank you so much to our panelists, Matt, Barika, Marquis, and Vic. Thanks so much to Sadaf. Thank you in the audience. I want to thank the people who fund City Limits Housing of Coverage of Housing, Neighborhoods First Fund, and the Charles Revson Foundation. Please check citylimits.org for coverage of these issues and as they relate to the election itself. And most importantly, please remember, early voting begins Saturday, October 24th in New York City. You can check our site or the Board of Elections for the schedule as to when and where, and election day itself is November 3rd. Thanks very much. Everybody vote, and please stay safe. Good night.
Okay. Thank you so much.